Um, and so today we have a very interesting and interdisciplinary session, which will look at two very topical and important issues. And these are environment and migration. So I think you will all agree that the environment and migration are certainly very, very important globally, but particularly important to the OSCE region. And before introducing the topic in greater detail and our speaker today, I would just like to go through the proceedings of today's session. So the idea is for a 30-minute presentation by the speaker, which will be followed by a question and answer session. And the attendees are, and you can do this in two ways. First, you can use the raise hand function of Zoom and wait to be called upon by myself to answer your question on video or audio. Or you can also use the chat function to ask questions, and this can be done during the session. During the lecture, you can think of some questions which you would like to ask the speaker. So the idea is to have a very interactive session. So please do feel free to ask as many questions as you would like. So today we have a discussion on two very important and recent publications. So our paper presenter today, Zane Chime, has recently published two papers, one on migration and the other on environment. So her first paper has been published by the United Nations University Institute on Comparative Regional Integration Studies. And this working paper is titled Mediterranean Lasagna of Migration Governance: What is the way forward for the regions in governing the Euromestic sphere? And Ms. Chime has also published another paper by the OSCE Academy, a policy brief. And this paper is titled The Role of Environment and Climate in Reshaping Comprehensive Security. So some very important and interesting papers, and we will hear some insights on these topics by our paper presenter, Zane Chime. So Ms. Chime is currently an Associate Research Fellow at the OSCE Academy, and also a policy analyst who focuses on the Euro macro-regional governance, regionalism in Europe and its neighborhood, and EU science diplomacy towards the southern neighborhood. So Ms. Chime was recently a top 40 under 40 India EU Young Leader 2020, which led her to explore the EU-India educational diplomacy in a broader context of the Asia-Europe meeting. She obtained professional experience as an international civil servant at the Secretariat of the Council of the Baltic States and a national civil servant in Latvia. Ms. Chime is a graduate of the University of Latvia and has completed a research internship at the United Nations University Institute on Comparative Regional Integration Studies. She is a member of the Academic Association for Contemporary European Studies, the Latvian Political Science Association, and the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists. So without further ado, I would like to ask Ms. Chime to present her paper.
Thank you, Mirza. Such a kind introduction. I'll proceed by sharing my screen. I see that the host has disabled participant screen sharing. May I kindly ask for the permission? I see that I am a host now. Okay. Could you please confirm that you see full screen my first slide?
Yes, it's seen.
Yes, we can see it. Yep.
Thank you so much. So, yes, then let me start by thanking the OSCE Academy for this wonderful offer to pursue a virtual fellowship. And I am equally grateful for this online opportunity to briefly introduce my recent research that touches upon OSCE. I hope that some background information that I will provide today will help to broaden the context in terms of how my research findings fit within the context of other recent publications dedicated to OSCE. So my background is in European studies with a more in-depth focus on the European Union. Thus, my analysis focusing on the OSCE builds on the previous research on the governance constellations defining the EU internally and the role of the EU internationally. Therefore, the two research outputs that I will be presenting today build on such concepts as structural foreign policy and governance power Europe. The defining books that capture more nuances of both concepts are displayed on the slide. In brief, structural foreign policy, and I quote, is a foreign policy which, conducted over the long term, aims at sustainably influencing or shaping political, legal, economic, social, security, or other structures in a given space. Structural foreign policy seeks to promote and support structural changes and structural reforms, tackle structural problems and constraints, or support and sustain existing structures. Whereas Governance Power Europe refers to the role of the EU as an influential entity that, and I quote, defines privileged partnership A. The term builds on the observation of the EU's gradual build-up and export of its institutional norms and principles to the neighborhood. The weight of this notion is further supported by the estimation presented by the Horizon 2020 funded project, Global Governance and the European Union Future. The EU is represented in half of all international organizations, in addition to, and sometimes even in place of, its member states. In particular, the EU is strongly represented in global multilateral organizations, namely, the EU is present in 74% of them. I mention these estimations as an invitation to think about the EU delegation to the international organization in Vienna in a broader perspective, meaning beyond the OSCE portfolio. Additionally, Globe report prepared by Tokhi and Eberturk reiterates Bradford's earlier appraisal that the EU is a unilateral regulatory superpower in the global economy. It echoes the global power Europe thinking. And if these types of power connotations didn't sound ambitious enough, then let me assure you that this is not the end of the list of appraisals. To add one more item to this list, I should add autonomous EU superpower, mentioned by Riederveld and Newsom in their introductory article for the Journal of European Integration, published in 2018. Since according to the findings of Tokhi and Eberturk, OSCE is a distinctively state-dominated organization, it is important to say a few words about the national or country level of governance as well. The GLOBE project is a helpful resource to explore in more nuance the intricacies of country memberships in key European forums. The graph with 3 circles show the member state composition, quoting GLOBE. As for the OSCE, all the EU states and all NATO states also participate in the OSCE. Thus, of its total of 57 member states, the OSCE shares 27 with the EU and 30 with NATO, leaving a total of 23 states as participants in the OSCE alone. This is a great example of multi-sided European governance, with countries being preoccupied with simultaneous dynamics in several multilateral forums. These are the notions that are echoed in the two publications that I will present today. Both allocate a considerable space to the EU engagement with various parts of the world. In the case of the UNICRIS working paper, the EU is at the center stage. In case of the OSCE policy brief, the EU is a notable reference point. The reason why I wanted to include in today's presentation two of my recent publications instead of focusing exclusively on my OSCE Academy policy brief should be clarified before I proceed with more nuanced elaboration on each of them. My initial thinking on why it is so vital to bring into the discussion revolving around the OSCE other regional organizations, as well as consultative and joint action forums, was based on the mapping exercise that I performed with the assistance of the regional integration knowledge system on comparative regional integration studies, or UNICRIS. It is a very helpful online source for realizing how densely governed our various geographical spaces. My observations stems from the Mediterranean context. Those of you who are closely following developments in this geographical area might be well aware of the 2020 OSCE Mediterranean Conference organized by Sweden, chair of 2020 Mediterranean Partners for Cooperation Group and the External Cooperation section of the OSCE Secretariat. The conference addressed the topic of promoting security in the OSCE Mediterranean region through sustainable development and economic growth. It covered a remarkably wide range of thematic domains, namely information technology, the fight against human trafficking, women, peace and security, youth engagement, and particular participation to counter violent extremism and radicalization that lead to terrorism. However, what I would like to draw your attention to is that the OSCE is just one of many regional formats that lends its support to manage various challenges encountered across the Mediterranean. This is the reason why my research related to the OSCE is guided by the conceptual underpinnings of complex interregionalism described by Fredrik Söderbaum. The term refers to, and I quote, the changing interlinkages of bilateral, regional, interregional, and transregional relations. Whereas interregionalism is understood as, and I quote again, as a situation or a process whereby two or more regions interact. For further details on how I apply this term in my study, please take a look at the section 1.1 Multilateral Interregionalism of my working paper. This is the guiding logic that also feeds into my OSCE policy brief that I will present during the concluding part of my presentation. My UNICRIS working paper focuses on the governance of mixed migration flows across the Mediterranean. It demonstrates the distinct role that the OSCE initiatives play in co-governing the Mediterranean. The OSCE excels with the second track diplomacy initiative called NewMed Research Network. It is coordinated by Institute Affari Internazionali, pardon my Italian, and supported by the OSCE Secretariat. Additionally, the OSCE network of think tanks and academic institutions and the Human Dimension seminars promote consultations and analytical exchange across a broad range of actors interested and involved in the OSCE Mediterranean affairs. Furthermore, in the context of more than 20 examined regional formats, OSCE has a special position of ties with the International Labour Organization being enshrined in the founding document, the Helsinki Final Act. I bring this detail to your attention in light of the suggested new summit in 2025, half a century after the Conference of Security and Cooperation in Europe that resulted in the establishment of OSCE. This is a good occasion to point out to the researchers in the audience that you are conducting your analysis in an outstandingly promising moment. It is a high time to thoroughly reflect on how the contemporary considerations should be translated into the core mandate of the OSCE to keep the organization enduringly relevant and responsive towards the needs of its participating states. Moving on with the contents of my working paper, the interactiveness of the OSCE was also demonstrated by the expert-level consultations co-hosted with the Central European Initiative. The high-level panel discussion entitled Beyond the Emergency, Improving the International Response to Large Movements of People was organized in 2017 as part of the Austrian chairmanship of the OSCE and Belarusian presidency of the Central European Initiative. This is another telling episode how important it is to bring into the discussion on the OSCE other multilateral dynamics and the OSCE interactions with other forums. These multidimensional vectors facilitated by the OSCE participating states in diverse multilateral settings deserve more scholarly attention. And I hope that my publications will serve as an inspiration for other researchers to help building more empirical blocks for further theoretical and conceptual debate on how to translate these complexities in the academic parlance and frameworks. Before I proceed with a brief overview of my OSCE policy brief, I would like to point out what a conducive background I experienced for elaborating on my approach towards the OSCE economic and environmental dimension. Two research outputs should be mentioned, as you can see on the slide. It is the report Restoring European Security, supported by Slovakia, and Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, pardon my German, published by Adelphi and OSCE. Both publications present certain like-minded traits with my OSCE policy brief. The report Restoring European Security points out, and I quote, to deal with transnational threats and challenges like pandemics, climate change, large flows of people on the move, and organized crime, states need to work together. Solidarity is self-interest. Cooperative security is a necessity, not altruism. And taking into consideration that before I commenced my fellowship at the OSCE Academy, I did research at the United Nations University Institute. Once reading the report, I highly appreciated that positions of the Secretary General of the United Nations resonate also among the intellectual circles focusing on the OSCE work. The report Regional Assessment for Southeastern Europe opens with the following sentences. Climate change can impact security in a number of ways. While it does not directly cause conflict, it interacts with other pressures, including population growth, unequal economic development, and resource constraints to influence security landscapes. Later on, it concludes, and I quote, climate change is increasingly impacting Southeastern Europe. These impacts can exacerbate pre-existing security risks. And taking into consideration my interest in complex interregionalism, what I especially found noteworthy about this report was its comprehensive analysis that referred to a number of international initiatives and organizations. such as the Sendai Framework and the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, as well as the Regional Cooperation Council as a notable regional forum. Overall, the lines quoted from both reports set good grounds for my further elaboration on the OSCE economic and environmental dimension, without questioning the relevance of the other dimensions. I would still argue that the recent research outputs prove the importance of exploring the economic and environmental dimension in greater detail, not only in terms of its past accomplishments, but in view of the earlier mentioned OSCE summit in 2025. It is important to carve out what the economic and environmental dimension can deliver in the present-day constellation of challenges faced across the OSCE, as well as distinct role OSCE can play in addressing those in close consultations and coordination with other international, regional, national, private and non-governmental actors already delivering their share of assistance and support. So as the slide of this public lecture indicates, my OSCE Academy's policy brief is called The Role of Environment and Climate in Reshaping Comprehensive Security. This publication captures a very brief overview of the evolution of the environmental considerations in the OSCE context, with a focus on the environmental and economic dimension, the Environment and Security Initiative, or ENSEC, and the way UN initiatives have been integrated in the OSCE work. It is a research policy brief. And by that, I mean that the attention is paid towards the earlier research outputs and how those articulate the accomplishments of OSCE. In addition, I bring into the discussion the notions of problems without passports. It refers to the challenges that transcend boundaries, a highly relevant term for the study of environmental and climate complexities and implications. And I was glad to see that this consideration of transboundary effects and the need for joint responses was also present in the earlier mentioned report, Restoring European Security. I am optimistic about the OSCE capacity to face future challenges due to its earlier displayed dynamism and receptiveness to the latest thinking on the interlinks between environment and security considerations. The essence is captured in my 3 recommendations. First of all, research delivers a substantial proportion of understanding about the work and impact of the OSCE. Therefore, this crucial component of meaning-making should be constantly re-evaluated and upgraded according to the latest identified complexities. Secondly, during future mapping and evaluation of the European security conditions and employed response measures, it is worth exploring the economic and environmental dimension and the ENSEC via the complex interregionalist lens to enhance the understanding of the distinct value and that these OSCE components bring to the overall landscape of European governance. Thirdly, a more nuanced analysis of horizontal complementarities across key multilateral forums, focusing on Europe, would help to map how different efforts, both tied to the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as distinctively environmental climate-related matters, discern the unique value added delivered by the OSCE and the sustainability of results delivered by its assistance. So to conclude, my earlier research on multi-level governance and transnational policy development in the EU setting translates into an invitation to bring more multilateral forums into consideration in the research focusing on the OSCE. I see this as a conducive means for developing further the awareness about the distinct role that OSCE plays in broader landscape of assistance and support delivered by various international, regional, national, private, and non-governmental actors. On the basis of my research focusing on migration and environmental policies, I would argue that this encouragement to bring more multilateral forums and peer initiatives into the research perspective applies across a number of thematic domains. What is left outside of the scope of both of my publications presented today, but is yet another intrinsic component of the addressed topics, is the future of multilateralism. OSCE should be an integral part of this debate. The suggested OSCE summit in 2025 is an opportunity to drive meaningful changes towards a multilateralism that is best equipped for the challenges of the 21st century. The report Restoring European Security provides some hints for the future multilateral consultations and cooperation. However, I would not treat that list of ideas as exhaustive, because multilateralism these days is much more multi-sided than the examples listed in this report. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm ready to respond to questions.